It is my pleasure to introduce Mick Chantler. Mick majored in history at Sonoma State and UC Davis. In college, his primary areas of interest were U.S. labor history in the late 19th century and modern European history. But since graduating with his master's in history, Mick has continued his independent study of American history with a focus on the Revolutionary era to the Civil War. For the past 15 years, Mick has been an instructor in several Bay Area lifelong learning programs. He regularly teaches courses for OSHER programs at Sonoma State, Dominican, and UC Berkeley. He specializes in the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, and our nation's founding era. Mick also lectures at a number of community-based educational venues, including Oakmont's own Lifelong Learning, where he truly is a favorite speaker. Mick lives in Sonoma with his wife, Robin, and his 2 standard poodle rescue dogs. He's lived in Sonoma for over 60 years. And one of my favorite quotes by Mick, "I don't know that humans really learn anything that they can apply from the study of history. It seems as though we just keep repeating the same mistakes. But the study of history is certainly a wild and entertaining ride." Please welcome Mick Chantler.
Okay, how does the volume sound on my microphone? Everybody can hear me well? Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Lynn and everyone else that was involved in inviting me here for your kickoff seminar on your fall and winter term here on Sunday Symposium. It's a pleasure to be back. I have enjoyed my lifelong learning teaching experiences here immensely, and I will be back in the spring if anyone is interested. I'll be teaching a class here in the spring on the Carter-Reagan years, that 12-year period of history that I think is incredibly important in getting a grasp, a handle on what's going on in the country and in the world today. So hope to see some of you back in the springtime. Today's talk deals with a very timely subject. It's a word, isolationism, in American history. Isolationism is a word we hear all the time now in the news, in the printed media, and it appears, and I want to underscore the word appears, because it may not be true. But it appears that we have entered into a new isolationist period in American history. And we'll be teasing out that question as our talk progresses today, because I think the appearance is somewhat misleading. Donald Trump, of course, campaigned as a neo-isolationist, a modern incarnation of isolationism, in 2016 when he first won the White House. This second term in office looks like a hybrid, a combination of certain isolationist themes combined with rigorous interventionism in many, many areas. So as we talk through our topic today, try to ask yourself, where do you think we're at today? It's confusing, of course, because the scene tends to change pretty rapidly in today's political environment, and what you think is true today may not be true next week. But generally, see if you can come to some conclusions as to where you think we're at on the spectrum today. The first slide introducing our topic today shows the first president and certainly the first ardent exponent or proponent of the doctrine of American isolationism. George Washington laid out the template for subsequent American presidents in so many areas that he became almost an unofficial writer of the Constitution. Now, he didn't write the Constitution, but certainly he had enormous influence on how the framers did construct our legal documents to found our republic. And his advice on the subject of isolationism lasted pretty much unchanged and intact, for the most part, for about 125 years. Then it changed, and we'll trace the evolution of how we've kind of gone through a series of waves, you might say, where for long periods of time we're isolationist, and then we shift course seemingly 180 degrees and become ardent, enthusiastic interventionists and go traipsing around the world doing sometimes some really good things and sometimes some really awful things. And then we seem to kind of burn out with that world tour business and we retreat back into isolationism again. So it's a wave and not a straight line. That's one of the critical points that I hope to bring out in our talk today. What we're seeing today is nothing new. As a matter of fact, it's actually more consistent in many ways with our earlier history. But it's not consistent with the world we grew up in. I mean, all of us in this room are more or less the same age. We all grew up and came of age after World War II, which was just the opposite of an isolationist phase in American thinking. And throughout our maturing years and our adult years, we have been accustomed to thinking that America is a key player in world affairs in every regard, economic, political, and military, and that was the way things were going to be indefinitely. And it's turning out to be that's not necessarily the case, as we'll see. So before we advance beyond our first slide, though, I think it makes sense to define what isolationism means and what it doesn't mean. No isolationist, not even the most enthusiastic isolationist, and let's say you could cite many examples of who you want to put up as your poster boy for American isolationism, but you could choose Robert Taft of Ohio as being one of the key proponents of an isolationist theory. He's the son of William Howard Taft, the president right after Teddy Roosevelt. And he was a senator from Ohio, very popular, at least in Ohio and in many parts of the country, so much so that for years he was referred to as Mr. Republican. And we'll be talking more about Taft a little bit later in our talk today. But for now, I just want to say that even Robert Taft, Mr. Isolationist himself, would never, ever have said we should have no dealings with the outside world. No isolationist would say we shouldn't trade, for example, overseas. That's impossible. Our economy is too interdependent in the world economy to propose something like that. No isolationist would say we should not have diplomatic relations with other countries. I don't think, I mean, that would just be preposterous to argue for a position like that. No one would say that American citizens shouldn't be free to travel abroad or that foreign citizens shouldn't be able to come here and study. Well, maybe some people would say that would not be a good thing. But for the most part, we want to have cultural and economic ties with the world, but not necessarily the rest of what has gone with that since 1945, which is constant intervention in the affairs of other countries, oftentimes leading to real messes like Vietnam, like the Iraq War, what the Republicans today now call the forever wars that we seem to have fought. And by the way, those forever wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth, those were bipartisan affairs. It wasn't just Republicans that advocated intervention in the Middle East, which led to these perpetual conflicts that never seem to have a satisfactory resolution. Democrats were very much on board with that as well. That was a bipartisan trend. But now we're starting to see a kind of a revulsion set in. I'll never forget, and many of you will remember this as well, when then candidate Trump in 2016 was nominated at the Republican National Convention that year. He said, and I quote now, President George Bush lied to the American people to get their support in fighting this ridiculous and unwinnable war in the Middle East. And the entire audience, 15,000 people, delegates, reporters, and onlookers, all applauded vigorously. Republicans applauding a man who said that George Bush was a liar because George Bush was an interventionist. He was someone that took us abroad and engaged us in what turned out to be an unwinnable and unsatisfactory conflict in the Middle East. And President, or then candidate Trump, was saying, we're going to stop all this. We're not going to be sending troops into hostile environments where they cannot succeed. We're going to tend to America first. And I believe that was the first time that I recollect that he used that expression, America first, which you hear all the time from people in the administration today. It's an unfortunate choice of words, though, because what does America first conjure up in the minds of most people in America who have studied 20th century American history? It conjures up the America First movement of the 1930s and early 1940s, which was a group of extremely conservative political and media pundits who argue that we should not get involved in World War II, that we should not come to Britain's aid, that we should not be fighting Adolf Hitler or the Japanese, that we should pull in our horns, so to speak, and stay put right here at home. Unfortunately, the America First movement of the 1930s happened to be also, to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, a pro-Nazi organization. One of its prime leaders was Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator. And as as President Roosevelt put it, Roosevelt, needless to say, was not a big fan of Charles Lindbergh and vice versa. But Roosevelt said to his vice president one time, that man, referring to Lindbergh, that man is a Nazi to the core. I can't prove it, but I know it's true. Now, why did he say that? Well, Lindbergh had been very chummy with the Nazi leadership during the 1930s, traveling throughout the country in 1938, never saying a negative thing or criticism about the anti-Semitic programs that were going on in Germany at that time, praising Hitler, praising Göring as being insightful statesmen and futuristic leaders of the world. He accepts a Medal of Honor from the Nazi regime, and it was just a really bad look. So getting back to my point of departure, I don't think it was a great idea for the current administration to borrow from a quasi-fascist organization the title of their movement today. But if you can strip it of that historical reference point and just look at it as a general overarching strategy for what's going on today, I think it's a fairly accurate term. The Trump administration wants to emphasize what benefits us most, not what benefits the rest of the world. And one of the historians that I just consulted in preparation for this talk today, a man named Charles Kupchan, said that whatever you think of Donald Trump, good, bad, or otherwise, one has to acknowledge that the man had an uncanny ability to tap into a deep reservoir of American thinking on the subject of how much we want to engage the world. He tapped into that in a way probably that no other modern or recent president or statesman has been able to do. He understood that Americans for a long, long time have had this revulsion against getting involved in the rest of the world, particularly in getting involved in European affairs. We're going to stress that American isolationism doesn't preclude us from getting involved in Latin America a lot. After all, Mexico, up until recently at least, was our biggest trade partner. Um, all throughout the 20th century, we regarded the Caribbean as an American lake. And it's kind of interesting that President Trump has renamed the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America now, because basically that is the way we treated Latin America all throughout the 20th century, is that this is our backyard and we're going to exercise a great deal of influence in the affairs of Latin America. Isolationism also hasn't precluded us from having a historic interest in Asia. We're going to see from long way back, we've set our eyes on the Pacific and the vast markets that are available to American manufacturers in Asia, in China, in Korea, and Vietnam, and Japan, and so forth. Isolationism, for the most part in America, has been directed at Europe, because Europe, of course, was the dominant world power, either Germany or England or France, throughout most of our history. And we just didn't want to get wrapped up in their interminable conflicts and alliance systems and scrapes that would inevitably draw us in. So isolationism is largely, as Donald Trump depicts here, kind of dismissively waving his hand, is Europe, get out of our face. We're not going to interact with you the way we have over the last, say, 75 years or so. It's a new sheriff in town, and we're going to change our whole approach. Washington certainly wasn't the only founding father who espoused isolationism. Thomas Jefferson, with this passage right here, I think sums up our whole isolationist mentality. That's going to hold, for the most part, some exceptions, but for the most part, until the late 1890s. As Jefferson puts it, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And that term, entangling alliances, means no permanent treaties connecting our fortunes with those of the outside world. We're going to tend to our own garden, and the rest of the world is going to have to solve its own problems. Where that term entangling alliances first surfaced in American history was during the reign, the first presidential term in office of George Washington. You might recall that during the Revolutionary War against England, we were able to win that war probably only because we formed an alliance, a treaty with France. France was the other major world power at the time. Probably one-on-one, America, the infant struggling revolutionary movement on the eastern seaboard, a nation that only had about 3.5 million people in it at the time. We probably could not have taken on England and won that conflict. So what do you do when you're the underdog? You get a big dog to come in on your side. And that's what we did. Benjamin Franklin goes to France in the 1770s and forms this treaty of alliance, because France probably didn't really care too much about helping us out. What France wanted to do is stick it to England, right? That's the way big power politics are played out. So this was supposed to be a perpetual treaty, 1778. Well, in 1793, the French are involved in a world war. The endless series of conflicts between revolutionary France and Britain. and their respective allies. This was a period of world war that lasted from 1792 until Napoleon is finally defeated in 1815 at Waterloo, and that puts the end of the French dominance in European affairs with the ending of those wars. But in 1793, the French come calling to us saying, look, we helped you guys out in 1778 to beat the British. Now we want you to return the favor and to help us out in our wars against Great Britain. And George Washington politely but firmly said, no, no, that treaty is no longer operational. That was with a different government. We hadn't formed our constitution yet. The French government was a different government than the monarchy that had signed the agreement with us. So Washington says, no, we're not going to honor that treaty. It's defunct, it's null and void and of no effect. And that precedent held true until World War II. We had no treaty of alliance with any other country between 1778 and 1941. We just didn't want to get involved with, even in World War I, when we entered in to that conflict, we did not sign a treaty of alliance with the allied powers of France and Britain and Russia. We entered in as a, quote, associate power. So fearful were we of getting bound up in entangling alliances that would have forced us to, by law, to enter into conflicts that really weren't to our interests. So Washington and Jefferson lay out the formula for America, and they say, look, we've got enough to do here in America, conquering the wilderness, settling the western frontier, building a national economy, populating this land. I mentioned to you a moment ago that we only had 3.5 million people at the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. That's not very many when you look at the map of the United States and you see all this empty space. So Jefferson and the other founding fathers said, no, we've got our plate full here. We don't want these alliances that are going to get us into endless squabbles with European powers that are much, much stronger than us. So what did the founding fathers think about these alliances and involvements with the rest of the world that made them such isolationists? I think the first answer is kind of implied by this slide here. British redcoats, obviously, these are reenactors, a photograph taken today of a reenactment of the Battle of Yorktown. But the early Americans had a deep-seated mistrust of what they called a standing military. We did not want to be a militarized nation. We did not want to have a large army that was going to, number one, threaten the liberties of the American people. That was the number one fear on the minds of the founders. And secondly, we didn't want to pay the bills for having a standing army. Great Britain, France, Germany, all the great powers of old Europe had huge armies. Napoleon was able to put armies of over 100,000 men into the field, which by 18th century, 19th century standards is a gigantic force, but that costs an awful lot of money. And the thinking on the part of the founders was this will bankrupt us. If we spend all of our money trying to replicate what the British have done, the only way we could do it is to become like England, which is to say the Bank of England depicted here in this drawing of the 18th century Bank of England was the financial wing of what Alexander Hamilton called the fiscal military complex. Fast forward to Dwight Eisenhower's farewell speech when he said, beware of the military industrial complex. You might remember that famous line. And Eisenhower should have known about that danger because he was chairman of the board, you might say, for 8 years. But he, he was pointing back to an ancient fear in America, and that is we don't want to see our economic system inextricably intertwined with militarism. If we do that, we're going to wind up just like France, England, Germany, which is to say, fighting endless wars, the forever war, because that's what the nature of European politics and great power confrontations was like in those days. It should be mentioned before we leave this, this feeling amongst the founders that we should avoid all of this wasn't universal. Alexander Hamilton was all in favor of it. Actually, what Hamilton wanted to do is replicate the British system here at home. He wanted to see us build up a powerful navy and army that would be funded through a powerful national bank. And that's going to cause all kinds of controversy in the early days of the Republic because people like Thomas Jefferson were not fans of this concept. Jefferson wanted America to be, as much as humanly possible, a peaceful nation in which people would be free to pursue their interests unencumbered by ruinously high tax rates, which would be required if you want to have a European style land army or a giant navy like the British had. The last founder, you might say, was James Monroe. He was a young man during the Revolutionary War, and then he's president from the period of 1816 to 1824. And it's under Monroe that we adopt the position that we're going to tell Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. And this is our territory. Both North and South America are of no concern to you. We will not tolerate any more incursions by the European powers into the Western Hemisphere, the notion known as the Monroe Doctrine. Actually, it should be called the Adams Doctrine, really, because John Quincy Adams, the son of our second president, John Adams, was the man who formulated this position. And that has been kind of or was our general point of view, I think, up until World War I. We don't want to have anything to do with Europe, at least in terms of permanent political connections. So that was probably a time in our history when isolationism actually was a good idea for America. We would have probably been squashed like a bug if we had allowed ourselves to get sucked in to European affairs at that time. We just weren't powerful enough. We weren't set up to fight countries like Great Britain or Germany or Russia. It just would not have worked. So I think the whole concept of isolationism was appropriate at one time in our history. I don't think it is anymore. I think the time long since passed when we could afford to say we're not going to have anything to do with the rest of the world. But it did make sense for quite a while. Accompanying the notion of isolationism as a practical strategy was also kind of a moral and psychological outlook, which has come to be called American exceptionalism. And it's a notion that's alive and well in America today. Maybe not quite as robust as it was a few years ago, but it's still there. And that's this idea that Americans are a better people than Europeans are. Europeans are pugnacious, greedy, immoral, particularly the French. They're degenerate. We are a pure people. We are the descendants of the Puritans, pure. We are God-fearing Protestants for the most part. Yeah, we have a few pesky Catholics that are sneaking in, but by and large, we are an unsullied people. Why do we want to get involved in European affairs? We'll just get mud on our white garments if we stoop to their level and start participating in their endless wars. The figure on the right showing America with the flag on top of a mountaintop, refers back to a saying. Well, it's depicted on the left of your screen, the saying on the bottom of the screen there, America shall be a shining city upon a hill. That was the position that the original Puritan founders in Massachusetts took. We're getting away from Europe. We don't want to have anything to do with that corrupt, old, rotten continent that despises the common man to the benefit of a handful of aristocrats and monarchs at the top of the heap. No, this is a new land and an opportunity to start a new way of living. And that idea, I think, has stuck with us for a long, long time. Why should we risk losing our virtue, you might say, by getting involved in European affairs? Now, one might think, if you look at this map, it shows how quickly we filled out the continental United States from 1789, our first year under the Constitution. And by 1850, we had basically taken over the entire landmass, at least, of the present borders of America. Obviously, Alaska and Hawaii come a little bit later, but rapidly we filled out the ownership of the Western territories in America, first with the Louisiana Purchase, when Jefferson bought all the land depicted in yellow on your screen here for a pittance. I think it was $15 million to get all of that land, which even in 1803 dollars wasn't that much, considering how much land we got. And then, of course, the other big acquisition was the Mexican cession that we gained as a result of our war against Mexico in the 1840s. And you might say, well, wasn't that an interventionist repudiation of isolationism? Basically, we picked a fight with Mexico. That was a war of choice. We did not have to go to war against Mexico. Mexico posed no threat to the United States. They were an unstable republic without much military or economic punch. And so there was no reason that that war had to take place, except for one, and that's California. The very place we're sitting or standing on today was too important for President Polk, James K. Polk, to allow it to slip out of his grasp. He wanted California, particularly he wanted San Francisco Bay, because it's such a natural harbor and the springboard to the Pacific. And his great fear, and it was not a paranoid fear or an unrealistic fear. His great fear is, look, if we don't take California from the Mexicans, somebody else will. The English were snooping around here. The Russians were up at Fort Ross. The French were showing some interest in California. We can't let that happen. We have to have continental security coast to coast, and the only way we can do it is by having California. Yes, if we get New Mexico and Arizona, of course, that wasn't their name at the time, but if we get all that land, that's all to the good also. But we don't want to allow California to slip into foreign hands. We want to be a blue water to blue water world power. And the way we do that is, well, we take what we need from Mexico. So we fabricated the grounds for a war against Mexico, and predictably, we won in pretty short order and peeled off this huge chunk of land, probably 3 times the size of France in that Mexican cession. Now, it should be noted, President Polk had even more grandiose ambitions at the conclusion of the Mexican War. We crushed the Mexican army. We could take whatever we wanted. He wanted to take all the land from Mexico all the way down basically to Mexico City. Leave Mexico City in the hands of the Mexicans, but everything north of Mexico City, he wanted that to be American territory. And the people who settled the war didn't think that was right. And they thought it was taking advantage of a weak power when they were down. We were kicking them in the teeth by doing that. I mean, we're already breaking off half their country and annexing it to the United States. Enough is enough. So Polk did not get his way. That's another story for another day. It's interesting that the president was overruled by the man on the spot who conducted these treaty negotiations. So why then wouldn't this be considered an example of interventionism? Picking a quarrel with a foreign country so we can seize their land. That sounds pretty imperialistic, and yeah, it was. But the point is, we stopped at the water's edge. We did not, at this point in time, we did not have designs on what's out there in the Pacific Ocean. Our interest in Hawaii, our interest in the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, all those places that come under American control in a few decades, at this time, that was not on our horizon. So that's why most historians don't feel that this Mexican adventure represented a departure from isolationism. Rather, it represented kind of the natural fulfillment of our manifest or obvious destiny. Let's see. Judy, I'm not getting this to advance. There we, there we go. The thinking was, this is a painting that was made in the mid 19th century depicting America's manifest or obvious or clear destiny. Our role in history was to conquer the West. And the young lady in the gauzy gown that's floating rather ethereally above the ground is the spirit of liberty, leading hardworking, courageous, intrepid pioneers from the East to the West. And you see the stagecoach down below her feet, and the trains, and the telegraph wires, and the frontiersmen advancing with their oxen, chasing off the Indians, sending the buffalo off in a panicked flee of the advancing white settlers of the continent. That was our aim, not to conquer the world, but to conquer the West. That was plenty enough of an assignment for our first period. And concomitant with that desire to conquer the continent was the development of American industry and manufacturing, making us a world economic power, which in James Polk's day, the 1840s, when we took this land from Mexico, was still a far off dream, but would be very, very quickly realized largely because of the Civil War. Because the Civil War was the first really modern war that we fought with hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the field, massive casualty figures. It was going to be an economically transforming war. And that's when the nation fully went all in on industrializing, building a factory system that could produce everything from war implements to consumer goods. And that spur of developing our economy, again, kind of reinforce this notion of isolationism. Why do we want to even think about getting involved in European affairs when we've got so much to do here and we've got the resources to do it? We've got the coal, we've got the factories that can build, make steel, that enables us to construct modern cities with high rises and so forth. That was our primary task. Now, something happens though in the 1890s that's going to change it. Two things. One is, as this man depicted on your screen here, Frederick Jackson Turner was his name, was a writer, a historian, who wrote a very influential book, a short book actually, but extremely influential, in which he described the psychological impact of the closing of the frontier, which happens about 1890. That was, by 1890, all the Indian tribes have been subdued and put on reservations. the place now was ours. Unquestionably, the United States was in control from the shores of the Atlantic to the shores of the Pacific. That was the good news. The bad news was we had no more worlds to conquer. We had no more challenges really ahead of us. In a sense, Frederick Jackson Turner was saying, we've sort of reached our limits now. And this is the end of history, in a sense, American history, because we've done it all now. Well, people like Teddy Roosevelt would have said, not so fast. There's lots of worlds to conquer yet. The underpinnings of Turner's thesis, though, I think, is Americans need a challenge. We liked fighting Indians. We liked going out and slaughtering the buffaloes and creating homesteads in the West, wherein people from all over Western Europe could come and settle and help develop this new civilization in fertile lands. If all that's over now because the frontier is filling up so rapidly and there's no more land to conquer out there, what are we going to do with ourselves? It's a good question. Parenthetically, by the way, it's not without significance, I think, that many American soldiers in Vietnam wore cavalry hats. And the helicopter assault teams often fashioned themselves after George Custer's army. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's army regiment, was resurrected in Vietnam as a helicopter assault team. This mindset that we've got to go out and fight wild Indians, in this case, wild Viet Cong, that mentality was still extremely active and potent in the American imagination. So now we're going to see a new view in the 1890s. If we don't have Indians to fight, we don't have land to conquer out west, what are we going to do? Well, President McKinley and his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, come up with a splendid proposal, and that's to go fight in Cuba and kick the corrupt old Spaniards out of Cuba, take over Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, and launch a new experiment in American history called imperialism, in which now we are consciously and deliberately turning our back on isolationism, and we're going to take our show on the road and show the world what a mighty force we are. Those of you that took my Teddy Roosevelt class here might remember that Teddy Roosevelt expands the size of the American Navy exponentially and sends the Navy, the Great White Fleet as it was called, because the ships were all painted white, sends them on a around the globe tour, making ports of call in every major country of the Pacific, and then Latin America, and finally coming back home, because he wanted to demonstrate America's power. And of course, it's rattling a sword too at the same time. It's showing the rest of the world we are a force to be reckoned with. And how are we going to manifest that force? Well, we're going to start gobbling up possessions overseas. The red dots you see in the Pacific Ocean on the map here illustrate how many possessions we took during this imperialistic expansion phase, from Midway, the Hawaiian Islands, Wake Island, Guam, all the way out to the Philippines. Why did we want all of these far-flung possessions? I mean, Wake Island, there's nothing much there. It's like a pretty barren, small island jutting out of the Pacific Ocean. Why? Because we wanted coaling stations for our Great White Fleet. We wanted ammunition dumps, places where our ships could refuel and rearm in order to project American force into Asia. That was the primary purpose of those Pacific conquests that we made during the 1890s. And initially, most Americans were pretty okay with these acquisitions. Where it got problematical was when we took the Philippines from Spain after the war. This was a direct repudiation of isolationist philosophy. George Washington would have said, the Philippines? Really? Where are they even? I mean, I don't know that many people in America in the early 20th century could have accurately located the Philippines. Uh, and there were lots of Filipinos who didn't want to become part of the American empire, and they rebel against our conquest of their country. And it triggers a 5-year, very, very ugly guerrilla war between Filipino revolutionaries and the occupying American army. You see picture in the lower right-hand corner of American soldiers torturing a Filipino with the water torture, something that came up again, as you might recall, during the post 9/11 wars on terror in America. And Americans did not like to see pictures of our boys picking on little tiny Filipino women and pushing them around. That seemed like a repudiation of American values. We're a better people than that. And I think we are. But for a while there, this was the natural consequence of imperial overreach. You don't get to conquer recalcitrant people without breaking a few eggs in the process. And a lot of eggs got broken during that Filipino campaign. It was been called by many historians our first experience of an Asian war. It was our first Vietnam, you might say, and had many of the same features of the Vietnam War. Endless warfare, grinding it out village by village, lots of war crimes, lots of terrible, terrible acts, atrocities really committed by both sides, not picking on the American army here. It was an ugly, ugly war. And a lot of Americans said, enough already. We don't want that. Let's go back to the halcyon days of George Washington, which we did for a little while until World War I comes along. And as we see here, that then was a period in which isolationism had to take a back seat to interventionism. We tried to stay out of the war. To Wilson's credit, President Wilson said when war first broke out in 1914, we're not going to get involved in this. We can stay clear of that bloodbath going on in France and Belgium. But ultimately, that proved to be impossible. And a propaganda campaign that you see on these posters calling on Americans to wake up and smell the coffee. We cannot stay out of this global conflict going on in Europe at this time. So we get involved, and we ultimately are successful, sort of. I mean, I say sort of because, of course, the Germans are defeated in World War I, but President Wilson wants to follow up with that victory over the Germans with a mechanism that would prevent future Holocausts like that, and that's the League of Nations. He hoped to convince Americans that if we participate in a world body that could solve problems, we could stay out of these kind of meat grinder type of wars in the future. But the American Senate would not go along with it. The American people had had enough of involvement, and they wanted to return to their isolationist ways, as this cartoon depicts. This was from Harper's Magazine in 1919 when the U.S. Senate defeats Wilson's call for America to join the League of Nations. And obviously, the person that drew this cartoon is very, very critical of the isolationists who scuttled Wilson's plan. The young woman on the left of your screen wearing the white gown, the word over her head is humanity. And she's casting an accusing finger at the United States Senator, who is depicted as sort of an ogre carrying a bloody sword who has just slain the world's last chance for peace, a dead woman's body at his feet. What follows then for about 20 years is the most rampant period of American isolationism that we probably have ever known. It was as though we said, enough, 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 enough of Europe, enough of wars like the one in the Philippines were going to pull back and concentrate on America first, which is a benign enough expression initially, but then very soon it became clear that it was a hotbed, the movement was a hotbed of bitterly reactionary forces led by Robert McCormick, the man who owned the Chicago Tribune newspaper, an ardent isolationist, and people like Charles Lindbergh. This was a powerful, powerful movement. As a matter of fact, it probably was the most powerful political movement in America at the time, which is why Franklin D. Roosevelt had to tread so carefully about getting us involved in World War II, because he knew the American people did not want to have anything to do with the war. And we stay out of the war for the first 2+ years until Pearl Harbor, and then, of course, the decision was taken out of our hands. Far more than just these two people, though, were adherents of America First. They would have rallies in which 30, 40,000 people would show up saying, no more war, stay out of Europe, and so forth. And one of the primary voices of this, kind of ironically, really, is Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and so forth, both of whom are very opposed to isolationism, as you might recall. But their father was right there with Lindbergh saying, we should not get involved in European affairs. It's not our quarrel. If Hitler defeats France, well, that's France's problem. It's not ours. If Hitler even defeats England, well, to hell with England. After all, I'm an Irishman. Am I supposed to shed tears over the demise of the British Empire? Joseph P. Kennedy might have said. And that sentiment resonated with a lot of people. It was really only until Pearl Harbor that Roosevelt was able to get us into the war. So Pearl Harbor is going to change everything for us for the next 50 years. From 1941 on, I know we're running short of time here. We want to save some time for questions, so I'm going to kind of come down the home stretch here. From 1941 on, we become an interventionist state. The realization is very, very clear that we cannot stay out of world affairs, and we're going to get involved in a very, very active way. Sometimes that's a good thing, oftentimes not so good, as America took on the role after World War II of being globo cop. That was an expression, kind of a play on words of that movie that was out in the 1980s or 90s called RoboCop. Well, America kind of took on the role of being the sheriff of the world. And that's going to get us home into a lot of jams. In my lifetime, and same with you folks here, we have fought 5 major wars. That's a lot for a peace-loving people, isn't it? From Korea to Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraqi freedom, and then the Afghan war. And that has created a backlash that I think helps to explain some, not all, but some of Donald Trump's popularity. Donald Trump, by calling George Bush a liar in 2016 at the Republican National Convention, was saying, we're not going to do these kinds of things anymore. It's not in our interest to get bogged down in a 20-year guerrilla war like Afghanistan and have it end so ignominiously, as we all remember that horrible, horrible scene in 2021 when we finally left Afghanistan and locals are clinging to the wheels of the aircraft out on the air tarmac. They're trying to get out because they know they're going to be slaughtered by the Taliban as soon as the American army leaves. It was an ugly sight. And I don't think Joe Biden's administration ever fully recovered from that. That would be my guess. And it helped to undermine his image as a powerful leader. And it creates a lot of future problems. Well, Trump is able to make hay with good reason, really. Clearly, we did stretch too far into these foreign adventures. And now we seem to be resisting interventionism. The figures on the screen here, the figure in the middle is Robert Taft, the man I referred to earlier, the senator from Ohio, who is sort of the high priest of American isolationism, bitter critic when he was in the Senate of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He would not support Roosevelt's efforts to get us allied with England and into the fight against fascism in Europe. Makes the statement, and this is kind of, it would be comical if it weren't so tragic. In the summer of 1941, Robert Taft says in an interview that's published in the New York Times, there's absolutely no way that Japan is ever going to attack us. They're not even considering it. They know it would be a foolish and futile move. Well, 6 months later, the bombs are falling at Pearl Harbor. So much for Robert Taft's isolationism. It clearly wasn't accurate. But we see kind of a resurrection of his thinking with a lot of the figures, not only in MAGA, but in the parts of the new conservatism that are not necessarily fully tied into MAGA. The figure on your left there is Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul. He's a United States Senator from Kentucky. Paul is an isolationist and makes it very, very clear we should not be involved in these European adventures or world adventures that are going to compromise our own national security. Our job is to secure American freedom first, foremost, and final endpoint. The figure on the right of your screen is Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, takes pretty much the same position, feels that, for example, we're wasting our money supporting the Ukrainian war against the Russians. What business is it of ours whether or not Ukraine remains an independent nation or is gobbled up by the Russians? It's not our problem. That's Hawley's position. That's the position that Robert Taft would have taken in 1939, 1940. Same position that Joseph Kennedy took. It's not our problem if France is ground under by the Nazi heel. It's not our problem if even England goes down the drain. Our job is to protect America. And that's what these two figures, as well as lots of others, almost entirely the MAGA movement, would sign on to that position. So many, many Americans, including not a small number of people that would be called liberals or leftists, are sick of the forever war. They're saying, look, this just doesn't work to our advantage. How can we just continue to send off our young men to fight in war after war, wars that have no conclusion, wars that can't really possibly have a fully satisfactory outcome for us? So I think that helps to explain a little bit of the Trump administration's isolationism. What it doesn't explain are some of the other features of the Trump administration in terms of foreign affairs. Trump has successfully been able to poach from the Democratic Party people like Tulsi Gabbard. She was considered a liberal Democrat, the woman in the upper left-hand corner. So, a congresswoman from Hawaii, scathing critic of American foreign policy for the last generation, feeling that both parties have become the party of war. And she considers herself someone working for peace. And she ought to know, by the way, since she served in Iraq. She was a soldier in the Iraqi war. And so she goes over to the Trump administration because she feels that Trump at least gives us a chance to avoid these endless wars. Steve Bannon in the lower left-hand corner, ultra right-winger, of course, and he says openly that he opposed both the war in Iraq as being a con job by the Bush administration uh, and the war in Afghanistan. Same thing with Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense now. So it's like we're kind of going back to that isolationist outlook, I think. Question on probably a lot of your minds is, will we abandon Ukraine? It's hard to say because Trump's position, and one of the, I think, very legitimate criticisms that we can put at Trump's feet is there's no long-term certainty about his grand strategy. It seems like now, like going back a month or two when he kicked Zelensky out of the White House, basically, it sounded like we were going all in for Putin at that time. But since then, he's been very critical of Putin. We don't know really where he stands. Is it isolationist? Is it, are we going to throw the Ukraine under the bus? Or are we going to resist? Don't know yet. Are we even going to pull out of NATO? That was one of the threats that Trump made during the first administration. Repeatedly, he said, if NATO doesn't start paying up and supporting the organization the way they should, we might just have to pull the plug. John Bolton, who is a supporter and an advisor to Trump, subsequently has become a bitter foe of the president, is very fearful that Trump will destroy NATO. Okay, final thought, and then I'll take some questions. Can we be isolationist in the 21st century? It seems not likely. But on the other hand, can we follow a policy that seems to be so chaotic, so inconsistent, and so contrary to our historical values? When Trump says, for example, we are going to take Greenland one way or the other, what does that sound like to you? When somebody says one way or the other, I'm going to have that. Well, crazy, someone said. It sounds very threatening too, doesn't it? It sounds like, look, if you don't sell it to us at a fair market price, whatever that would be for Greenland, we can just take it. I mean, we've got the troops. Denmark, you don't. So wise up. When he says we're going to have Gaza, I'm going to take Gaza, no question. And we're going to turn Gaza into a luxury vacation destination for American tourists. We're going to have high-rise hotels on the beaches there that Four Seasons can make a presence there. We'll have championship level golf courses all throughout Gaza. And the Gazan people, the people of Gaza, the Palestinians, will just have to go elsewhere. There's plenty of Arab countries that will take them and give them nice homes. Right, there's not. Most of the Arab world does not want to have anything to do with the Palestinians. They're regarded essentially as trailer park trash in the Arab thinking. Whatever they say in public, Arab leaders are not interested in taking 2.5 million Gazans into their borders. That's just not realistic. So, is Trump an isolationist? Well, in some ways, yes. These high tariffs, these bans on foreign students, cutting off immigration, those are all very typically isolationist positions. But taking Greenland, taking Gaza, those are anything but isolationist stands. So I don't know where we stand right now, and neither does the rest of the world, which makes right now things kind of hairy. Because, final thought, and then we'll take questions. If history teaches us anything, and as Lynn said at the outset, I doubt that it does, really. We have short memories. We don't remember much of anything. But history should teach us this lesson, and that is the world stands a better chance to be secure, safe, and free from wars when you have a responsible hegemonic power running the show. Hegemonic is an ancient Greek word that means the top dog, the major power. We've had in Western history two prolonged periods of peace in our history, and that was the second and third century AD, when Rome was so overwhelmingly powerful, nobody could challenge her. And therefore, there was peace all throughout the Mediterranean basin. Second time we had a long period of peace was the 19th century, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars until World War I. We had basically 100 years of peace. Yeah, there were little skirmishes, but nothing of any major consequence. Why? Because Britain was unchallengeable at that time. Britannia rules the waves. And her navy was so powerful that no one could directly challenge her. And that meant peace. People don't get into wars if they think the hegemon, the big power, can come in and just eat your lunch if you get out of line. And that's what the Roman lesson was. That's what the British. My hope would be that we could act that role as the responsible hegemon. And I don't think it's